I had been driving along the Pacific Coast Highway for hours, the darkness pressing against the car windows, the headlights cutting through occasional fog, and the black stretches between streetlights. I was returning from a late-night camping trip at Big Sur, exhausted from the day's hiking, carrying a heavy pack and the lingering ache in my shoulders and knees from uneven trails and rocky ascents. The ocean was just a distant murmur, the scent of salt faint in the air whenever I opened a window for a brief breath of cold night wind. I knew I couldn't make it to San Francisco in one go. My eyes were heavy, my reaction slowed, and the idea of driving any further into the night felt reckless. I spotted a small motel tucked just off the highway, its single neon sign flickering weakly, the red and blue tubes buzzing and sputtering. The place looked like it hadn't seen a proper renovation in decades. I turned off the engine and pulled into a nearly empty lot. A single bulb hung crookedly above the entrance, throwing a dull circle of light onto cracked asphalt. The parking lot had stains in irregular patches, dark brown and rust-colored, dried into the concrete. I didn't pay much attention. I just wanted a bed, a shower, and sleep. The receptionist was a man in his 50s, with a worn, weathered face and a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. He handed me a key with a barely audible jingle and a nod, but I was too tired to register anything beyond the necessity of getting to the room. The lobby smelled faintly of mildew, disinfectant, and something faintly coppery, like metal left to rust in damp conditions. There was a small table with an ashtray filled with cigarette butts and a stack of tourist pamphlets that looked decades old. I dropped my bag onto the counter for a moment while filling out the registration slip, and even in my fatigue, I noticed the way his eyes lingered on me, but I pushed the thought aside. The room was on the second floor, and the carpeted stairs creaked with every step. The hallway was dim, lit by wall sconces that gave off a dull orange glow. The smell hit me immediately, a mixture of carpet cleaner, dampness, and something faintly organic. I tried not to think about it, and inserted the key into the door. The lock turned stiffly, and the door opened with a groan. Inside, the room was small, a single queen bed with an old mattress, a side table, and a dresser with a cracked mirror. The wallpaper was peeling in some corners, and the paint around the window frame was chipped. I set my pack down and swung it open, dragging out my overnight bag. As I bent to pull out my sleeping clothes, I noticed faint brownish stains near the baseboard along one wall. At first, I told myself it was rust from the heating vent or residue from old carpet glue. The edges were uneven, and the color blended in a way that could be explained by age and neglect. I tried not to stare too long and focused on unpacking. I went into the bathroom to brush my teeth and wash my face. The tile floor had smears in similar brownish hues along the edges near the base of the wall. The stains were irregular, almost as if something had been dragged across the floor or smeared carelessly. I crouched down to examine them closer, using the flashlight on my phone. The pattern didn't make sense. Too random to be any deliberate design, too organic to be dirt tracked in from outside. My stomach tightened slightly, but I was too tired to dwell on it. I took a few photos anyway, a vague sense that I might need evidence or that my mind was tricking me into seeing patterns where there were none. I showered, the water lukewarm, the pressure weak, and the drain sluggish. Steam filled the bathroom quickly, making the stains along the floor more visible. They were streaked in a way that suggested they weren't just old marks. They had depth, a texture that seemed unpleasantly sticky. I told myself it had to be something mundane, like rust, grime, or residue from past guests. I finished quickly and wrapped a towel around myself, trying to ignore the unease creeping in. The bed was firm, the sheets thin and worn, but I was too exhausted to care. I laid down, feeling the mattress sag unevenly under my weight. My body ached, my legs stiff from hiking, my back sore from the pack. I tried to sleep, but the room was too quiet. The faint hum of the highway reached me through the thin walls, and I could hear the occasional car shifting gears or braking somewhere in the distance. Every creak from the ceiling above, every shift in the bed frame, felt amplified in the silence. I rolled over onto my side and glanced toward the baseboard where the stains had been. My eyes traced the irregular shapes in the dim light of the street lamp outside. The room suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in, and I realized my imagination was turning the stains into something more deliberate than they really were. I forced my gaze away and closed my eyes, focusing on my breathing, counting slowly, willing sleep to come. Sometime in the night, I woke to a noise, soft dragging, coming from the other side of the wall. At first, I thought it was another guest, or perhaps the wind moving a loose panel outside the window. I held still, listening. The sound repeated, a slow, intermittent scraping, like something being moved carefully across a hard surface. My heart rate picked up, and I forced myself to remember I was alone in a motel, not in a forest at night. I told myself the sound was pipes, settling wood, or some other mundane cause. The rational part of my mind wrestled with the primal unease building in my chest. Morning came slowly. The sun was just beginning to leak across the horizon, pale light seeping through the thin curtains. I forced myself out of bed, legs stiff, eyes blurry. The stains I had seen the night before were gone. I crouched, scanning the baseboards and bathroom floor carefully. Not a trace remained. The faint smell that had lingered in the air was gone as well, replaced with the neutral scent of cleaning chemicals. I felt a strange mix of relief and frustration. Had I imagined it all? I packed my bag methodically, trying to keep the experience at the forefront so I could make sense of it later. I walked to the lobby, the fluorescent lights harsh after the dimness of the room. A few other guests were sitting in the chairs, nursing coffee and reading newspapers. I caught fragments of whispers about prior incidents at the motel, rooms with stains that appeared and disappeared, items misplaced or vanished, strange noises in the night, but no one explained more than that. Their glances were wary, and the way they avoided my eyes suggested a shared understanding I wasn't part of. I paid for the room, collecting my receipt and key. The receptionist looked up from his ledger with the same smirk as before, acknowledging me without any hint of concern. I left the motel, the sunlight now strong against the faded paint of the building, the air crisp with the morning chill from the coast. I paused at the car, letting the experience settle, realizing I had gotten what I came for, a place to sleep, but at a cost to my peace of mind. The drive north to San Francisco was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the images from the room. The streaks along the baseboard, the smears in the bathroom, the fleeting sound in the night. Every motel I passed on the highway after that felt suspect, every shadow in a room amplified. I thought about returning, trying to understand what had happened, but something inside me refused. I couldn't reconcile the mundane explanations with the instinctive unease that had settled in my chest. I never went back to that motel. I never stayed in small, isolated motels along the Pacific Coast Highway again, opting for chains with spotless reputations and visible staff. The experience lingered, subtle but persistent, a reminder of how quickly normalcy could disguise discomfort, how easily the familiar could become disquieting. The memories of the room and its vanished stains remained with me, not as horror in the supernatural sense, but as something equally unsettling. The awareness that some spaces hold histories and traces we can't easily explain, that the line between fatigue, imagination, and reality can blur when you're exhausted, alone, and in a place designed only to hold you temporarily. Looking back now, I recognize the story for what it is, a small, private horror grounded in the ordinary. There were no monsters, no specters, no implausible phenomena, only stains, strange sounds, and the subtle, insidious unease of being in a room that wasn't entirely clean, entirely safe, or entirely forgotten. It was personal, immediate, and entirely believable, and that made it worse. The motel itself became a marker in my mind, a place I would avoid indefinitely, not for what I could prove, but for what I had felt. It was a complete experience, beginning with exhaustion, moving through suspicion, and ending with a cautious, permanent avoidance. I had needed sleep, and I got it, but I had left part of my certainty, part of my comfort, behind in that room. I never questioned that decision. I never doubted it, and I never returned. I was driving back to Los Angeles late in November, after a week visiting family. The roads were empty, and the sky was clear, with stars so sharp they looked close enough to touch. I wanted to make time overnight, so I kept the car moving, the headlights cutting through stretches of desert that seemed endless. At some point, fatigue began to creep in. The monotony of the asphalt and the faint scent of my own coffee-stale breath made me pull over. I needed a break, somewhere quiet, before I forced myself back onto the road. The motel was one of those old Route 66 relics, the kind I had passed countless times but never thought to stop at. It was 2 stories, a long, low building with neon signs buzzing faintly in the darkness. The red and yellow tubes flickered in a rhythm that made my eyes ache, and the paint on the walls was peeling, curling in the desert wind. The parking lot was nearly empty. Only a few cars sat scattered near the rooms, headlights off, windows dark. The air smelled of dry dust, old smoke, and something faintly metallic that I couldn't place. Inside, the lobby was dimly lit, a single hanging bulb above the counter casting long shadows across a scratched tile floor. There was a faint smell of cleaning chemicals over the lingering dust, and the faded wallpaper had tiny holes near the corners, like the place hadn't seen renovation in decades. The clerk was behind the counter, older, with a face that looked like it had been shaped by the desert sun, but otherwise I barely registered him. I just needed a room, somewhere to lie down for a few hours. My room was at the end of a narrow hallway on the second floor. The carpeting was threadbare, its pattern faded into something beige and gray that might once have been cheerful. The door creaked as I opened it, revealing a room that was dusty but functional. A double bed with a lumpy mattress sat against the wall, sheets pulled tight, but with an odor of must lingering in the corners. The furniture, dresser, nightstand, chair, was all scratched and worn. The air conditioning unit rattled faintly as I switched it on, filling the room with a low hum. Outside, the neon sign buzzed through the thin curtains, throwing a reddish glow across the walls. I showered quickly and lay down exhausted. My eyelids felt heavy, and the hum of the air conditioner mixed with the faint wind outside. At first, I dozed lightly, the kind of sleep where you're aware of everything around you, but too tired to move. Then, around midnight, I heard it. A faint scratching, almost like nails on wood, followed by heavy thumps above the ceiling. I sat up, listening. The sounds weren't random. There was a pattern, the kind of movement that suggested something large pacing back and forth. I froze, my stomach tightening. I got up and stepped carefully across the floor. The sound stopped the moment I moved. I pressed my ear against the ceiling and waited. Then the thumping started again, slower, deliberate, each strike resonating through the thin floorboards. I left the room and went into the hallway, listening. The place was silent, except for the faint hiss of the neon outside. I considered going back to the lobby, but the thought of walking down that long hallway with nothing visible in the darkness made my chest tighten. I checked the corners of the ceiling, tapping lightly on the plaster. Nothing moved. I went to the window and opened it slightly, the desert air cold and sharp against my face. The moon was low, casting silver light over the cracked asphalt and the empty stretches of sand beyond. I looked up at the roof. The boards were loose in places, curling with age. There was no animal, no maintenance worker, nothing obvious. Yet the noise continued sporadically, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was above me was waiting, listening. I returned to the bed, pulling the sheets over myself, but sleep didn't come. Every creak, every small settling of the building made my heart jump. The air conditioning rattled, the neon buzzed, and outside, the wind stirred faint whirls of dust that caught the light like sparks. I stayed awake until the first gray traces of dawn, muscles tight and senses on edge, staring at the ceiling and imagining every possibility. When the sun finally rose, I got up and went to the window again, looking for some clue to the night's noises. That's when I noticed the tracks. At first, they looked like shadows, but as the light strengthened, I saw them clearly. Paw-like prints, enormous, with deep claw marks pressed into the tar of the roof. The prints were spaced far apart, suggesting a large, heavy creature. They led from the ridge of the roof toward the edge, then vanished into the desert beyond. I studied them, tracing the line with my finger on the glass. The spacing, the depth of the impressions, it was all consistent with something real, heavy enough to make the roof creak, something alive. I stepped outside onto the balcony, cautious. The air was crisp, dry, and carried the faint smell of dust and creosote. The boards underfoot sagged slightly, but they held. I leaned over the railing, looking at the roof edge and the desert beyond. The tracks ended at the edge, and from there nothing. No animal was visible, nothing moving. The wind had erased the faintest traces in the sand. I didn't feel relief, but I felt clarity. Whatever had made those sounds, whatever had left those tracks, it was gone, following the path it had chosen into the desert. It wasn't supernatural, and it wasn't something that could follow me. It was a wild thing, probably a coyote or mountain lion, maybe something larger, curious or hungry, that had found the old boards of the roof tempting or accessible. The building's age, the loosened boards, the thin ceiling, had amplified every sound, every footfall, making it feel close, threatening. I packed quickly, leaving the room exactly as it had been, and carried my bag down the stairs. The neon sign buzzed as I passed under it, casting its red glow across my face. Outside, the parking lot was empty except for my car, the air crisp with morning chill. I started the engine, the sound loud against the quiet of the desert. The road stretched before me, empty and bright in the early light. I drove west, keeping the motel behind me, glancing once in the rearview mirror at the roof I had just left. The experience stayed with me, not because it was unexplainable, but because it was real. The tracks, the sounds, the awareness of something large moving above my head in the quiet desert night. It all reminded me how thin the line can be between safety and exposure, between routine and something entirely unfamiliar. I thought about the motel, its creaking boards, the desert stretching endlessly beyond it, and I understood that some places simply hold more than they appear to. They hold history, and the random movements of creatures that we rarely see. I never returned to that stretch of Route 66 at night. Even months later, when I passed near it in daylight, the memory of the paw-like tracks and the heavy thumping above my head was vivid. The story had a simple explanation, but the clarity didn't lessen the unease. It was a reminder that the world is larger and older than we often acknowledge, and that sometimes the most ordinary settings, a dusty motel, a creaking floor, a desert night, can become the stage for moments that are entirely unforgettable. By the time I reached Los Angeles, the memory had settled into a quiet vigilance. I could tell myself it was an animal, the roof weakened, the desert alive, and yet the sensation of the night, the thumps, the scratching, the long, empty hours awake, remained sharp. It wasn't a story I would share casually, but it was real. It was the sort of experience that doesn't require exaggeration or supernatural framing to be terrifying. The evidence was there in the tracks, in the sound, in the quiet aftermath, and it stayed with me, exactly as it had happened. I drove down Skyline Drive all evening, chasing the Milky Way as it stretched across the Shenandoah Valley. The sky was impossibly clear, the stars dense and bright, the kind of night that made the whole world feel small. I had spent hours at different overlooks, adjusting my tripod, fiddling with exposure times, and capturing the faint trails of light left by the distant galaxies. By the time I finished, the park was closed. The gates were down, the rangers' trucks gone, and I realized I had no choice but to find a place to stay for the night. My phone's GPS showed a cluster of motels along Route 340, just beyond the edge of the park, so I headed down the winding roads, trying to keep the car steady through the hills and curves, the headlights cutting through thick pockets of darkness. I found it tucked between trees on a quiet stretch of road. The neon sign flickered weakly, the letters half-lit, casting an orange glow over the cracked asphalt of the parking lot. Only a few cars were parked near the far end. The building itself was low and long, the paint peeling, the roof sagging in places. As I pulled up to the office, I noticed the receptionist barely looked up. There was a desk cluttered with papers, a small fan that rattled when it oscillated, and a faint smell of cleaning products mixed with something older, damp, and musty. I checked in, paid in cash, and received a key with a faded number stamped on a metal tag. Room 7. When I opened the door, the smell of mildew hit me first. It was faint but unmistakable, a wet, earthy odor that seemed to cling to the carpet. The room was small, the furniture sparse. A bed with an old comforter, a nightstand, a small lamp, and a dresser with warped drawers. The window faced the parking lot and the tree line beyond. The walls were painted a dull beige, scuffed and nicked in multiple places, and the corners of the ceiling were darkened by what looked like water stains. As I unpacked my camera gear, I noticed faint scratches along the doorframe, long shallow lines that didn't seem accidental. I traced them with my finger, but the wood was dry, rough. Nothing in the motel's appearance suggested any reason for the scratches. No pets, no children, nothing. By midnight, I was tired but restless. I had barely eaten, the day spent driving and photographing. I had set my camera for a few long exposures to capture the stars above the tree line visible from the window. As I adjusted the settings, I heard something outside the door. Heavy footsteps, slow at first, then more deliberate. They weren't light or hesitant, but firm and measured, like someone carrying a load. I froze. The building was old. Walls creaked naturally, floors groaned when pressed, but these steps were different, too heavy for a single person. I pressed myself against the wall beside the bed, straining to hear. The steps stopped for a moment, then shifted, almost circling the door. I waited, holding my breath. I approached the peephole. Nothing. Just the dim parking lot, the shadows of the few cars stretching across the cracked pavement. Then I saw it. Beyond the lot, moving quickly through the treeline. At first, it looked like an animal, a deer maybe, but the movement was too fast, too smooth. The low-hanging branches barely moved as it passed, and then I noticed the eyes. Two glowing points of light, low and wide apart, scanning the edge of the lot, moving unnaturally. I stepped back, my heart pounding. I slammed the door, flipped on every light, and clutched my phone, hoping for service. No signal. The screen remained blank. I tried again, moving to different windows, but still nothing. The room felt smaller, heavier, the darkness pressing in from the corners. I stayed awake, moving cautiously from one side of the room to the other. Every time I thought it had passed, a shadow would flicker across the curtains, or a sound would scrape through the floorboards. I tried to rationalize it, maybe a stray dog, someone hunting through the woods, a neighbor's old vehicle, but none of it fit. The eyes weren't ordinary. They were precise, calculated, aware. I didn't sleep. I barely breathed. The hours crawled by, each minute a stretch of tension, every rustle or snap outside making me flinch. I even checked the windows for any sign of entry points. Everything was locked. Nothing was broken. Nothing seemed disturbed. Yet the feeling lingered, a heavy awareness that someone or something had been watching, waiting, moving along the edge of the property. Morning finally came, pale and gray, the sun struggling through a thick layer of cloud. I cautiously stepped outside, shoes crunching against gravel. The lot was empty except for a few scattered cars. Then I noticed the tire tracks. They led from the treeline, deep and wide, almost like those of a large truck, and stopped at the edge of the lot. Beyond them, no marks. No indication of where they had gone, no disturbances in the soil or grass. I walked the distance slowly, examining the impressions, the scuffed debris, the crushed undergrowth. Nothing in the tracks suggested a simple explanation. The pattern didn't match any vehicle I could think of, no ordinary tires I had seen. It was as if the tracks had appeared, traveled a short distance, and then vanished. My stomach tightened. I spent the rest of the morning cleaning up, packing my gear, and moving on. I didn't see anyone else around, and the receptionist barely acknowledged me when I returned the key. The experience felt like a fragment of the night, something I hadn't fully grasped, but I couldn't shake the memory of those eyes, moving silently, watching from the darkness beyond the parking lot. I drove away slowly, glancing back at the flickering neon sign, the motel receding behind a curtain of trees. I made a mental note never to stop at that place again. Later, I researched the area, local forums, and news archives. No reports, no incidents, nothing. It didn't make the memory less real, though. I couldn't explain the tracks, the eyes, the heavy footsteps, but I knew what I had seen. The world felt larger, darker, and far more unpredictable after that night, and I drove the rest of Skyline Drive with a quiet tension, my senses alert, waiting for the ordinary to become extraordinary in the smallest, most unsettling ways. I pulled off the highway just after midnight, tired and tense from hours of driving through the rain-slicked roads of rural Pennsylvania. The GPS had long since stopped showing reliable signals, and the small towns I passed seemed closed and empty, their streets illuminated only by the dull orange of streetlights. The nearest sign for a motel promised vacancy, and I was too exhausted to care about reviews or appearances. I turned onto a narrow side road, flanked by thick trees that pressed in close to the pavement, their leaves trembling in the wind. The sign read Ridgeway Motel, flickering unevenly as if powered by a weak or faulty circuit. The building itself was long and low, a single story with peeling paint and streaked windows, the fluorescent lights inside buzzing softly. The parking lot was nearly empty. A few cars were scattered across cracked asphalt, their surfaces glistening with rain. I parked near the far end, the distance giving me a sense of isolation. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the air smelled damp and earthy, mixed with the faint chemical tang of cleaning products lingering near the entrance. I grabbed my bag and walked toward the office, my shoes squelching slightly on the wet concrete. The office door creaked when I opened it. Inside, the small reception area smelled of mildew and stale coffee. The fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting shadows that made the space feel smaller than it already was. The desk was cluttered, an uneven stack of papers, a jar of pens, and an old rotary phone that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. A man sat behind the desk, older than I expected, with a lined face and thin, graying hair. He barely looked up as I approached, nodding slightly before gesturing toward a registration form. I filled it out, the pen scratching against the paper louder than I wanted in the quiet room. The keys jangled as he handed me a brass key with a number etched into it. The handle of the door to the hallway was cool under my fingers as I stepped inside, the carpeting threadbare and damp in patches, the smell of old fabric mixed with something faintly metallic lingering in the air. The room was small, furnished simply with a bed pushed against the wall, a nightstand with a small lamp, and a dresser whose drawers stuck slightly when I opened them. The window overlooked the parking lot, but the glass was streaked with rain and dirt, distorting the view. I set my bag down and turned on the bathroom light, the sudden brightness harsh against my tired eyes. The tiles were cracked and chipped in places, the grout darkened from years of use. I ran the water to wash my hands, noticing that the drain gurgled and bubbled, the sound echoing strangely in the tight space. After a moment, I sat on the edge of the bed, letting the quiet fill the room. Outside, the wind had picked up again, rustling the leaves and making the trees sway. Every so often, I thought I heard the scrape of tires or the faint echo of footsteps across the lot, though the parking spaces were mostly empty. The motel had a kind of stagnant, heavy energy, not threatening but uncomfortably still, like a place caught in time, overlooked and forgotten. I lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythmic tap of rain against the window and the occasional distant hum of a passing car on the highway. Sleep was difficult. Every small noise seemed magnified in the silence. The air conditioner clicked and whirred irregularly, sometimes pausing for a long beat before starting again. A loose shutter banged softly against the wall outside, the sound sharp in the otherwise muted environment. I got up several times to check the lock on the door, each time noticing details I hadn't before. The slight gap where the door didn't quite meet the frame, the scuff marks on the floor near the entrance, the faint shadow of something pressed against the curtain that wasn't moving but suggested someone had been there. Each time I returned to bed, I tried to focus on the simple reality. It was just a roadside motel, old and poorly maintained, nothing more. Morning came slowly. The sky was a pale gray, the light diffused through thick clouds. I pulled back the curtain, and the wet asphalt of the parking lot glistened in the dim light. A few cars had arrived overnight, their surfaces dotted with raindrops. The man from the office had moved along to clean the other rooms, his presence felt in the quiet steps and the occasional door opening and closing. The smell of coffee and frying bacon drifted faintly from somewhere in the building, adding a sense of normalcy. I ate a small breakfast at a table near the lobby, observing the details around me. The scuffed linoleum floor, the crooked picture frames on the walls, the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above. Nothing was overtly alarming, but the air still held that strange, heavy weight that made every small movement feel significant. After breakfast, I stepped outside to stretch, the cold, damp air a relief after the warmth of the room. The motel sat in a small clearing, bordered by dense forest that rose sharply on one side. The silence of the surrounding trees was nearly complete, interrupted only by birdsong and the occasional drip of water from the eaves. I walked back to my car, noticing how isolated the motel really was. Beyond the road, there were no other buildings in sight, only the forest stretching in all directions. The isolation gave the place a quiet intimacy, but also a subtle tension. I realized that the unease I felt the night before wasn't something sinister. It was the weight of being completely alone in a place that had clearly been lived in, used, and yet neglected. There was history here, small unnoticed details in the wear of the floors, the fading paint, the dented furniture. The motel had character, and with it, a sense of vigilance. By mid-morning, I was packed and ready to leave. I returned the key, and the man at the desk gave a faint nod, no words exchanged. The ride back onto the highway was smooth, the tension of the night dissolving slowly with the familiar rhythm of the road beneath the tires. As I drove away, I looked back at the Ridgeway Motel. In the daylight, it seemed less intimidating, more like a tired sentinel of the highway, quietly standing guard over its small stretch of road. I realized then that the unease I had felt was not fear, but attention, an awareness of the place and its history, of the people who had passed through, of the quiet persistence of time marked in paint, carpet, and tile. The memory of the night stayed with me, not as a story of terror, but as a lesson in observation and patience, in noticing the life in a place that had long since been abandoned to routine. It was a quiet, grounded sort of unease, a reminder that even ordinary places hold a depth of experience if you take the time to notice it. I drove on, the highway stretching endlessly ahead, the Ridgeway Motel receding behind me, its presence lingering gently, a small pulse in the rhythm of the road. I pulled off the Blue Ridge Parkway, just as the sky was folding into deep shades of navy and black. The air had a chill that cut through my jacket and left my cheeks stinging. I had been hiking all day, following a trail that wound up the slopes with almost obsessive twists, through pine and hardwood forests whose leaves were already thin and brittle from the early frost. My legs were sore, my back ached from the pack I'd carried, and I just wanted a bed, a shower, and somewhere quiet to let my body stop complaining. I saw the motel from the road, small and squat, a single story of weathered siding with a parking lot that looked barely wide enough for 2 cars. The sign flickered unevenly, one of those old, green neon rectangles that buzzed like an electric hum in the cold. The room smelled faintly of must and detergent, the kind that only comes from sheets being laundered on some schedule that's more about efficiency than freshness. The carpet was threadbare in places, and I could see the outline of the baseboards where the walls had been cleaned repeatedly without ever being repainted. I dropped my bag on the bed and flopped down, listening to the soft hum of the heating unit, which rattled a little with each cycle. From the window, I could see the highway curving through the hills, the headlights of cars like tiny fireflies moving slowly across the dark landscape. I had noticed the room next door as soon as I checked in. The door was closed, and the window drawn halfway, the curtain moving slightly in a wind that didn't seem to exist inside the building. From the first night, I saw shadows shift, a silhouette that looked like a man sitting in a chair near the window, though he never moved beyond that. He never came out. No luggage, no car parked near the entrance. It struck me as odd, but not alarming at first. People had all sorts of habits, and the building was old enough that the wiring sometimes made lights flicker, and drafts made curtains sway. On the second night, I woke around 2 a.m. to the sound of soft thumps. At first, I thought it was the old building settling, the kind of creak and groan you get in wooden floors when the temperature drops. But then I heard it again, deliberate, furniture being dragged across the floor, slow, cautious scraping, almost rhythmically timed. It stopped after a few moments, only to start again minutes later. I stayed still under the covers, listening. The sound was faint but distinct, followed by a door opening, the kind of click that would make when it swings on a hinge without lubrication. I could hear soft whispers, too quiet to understand, like someone talking to themselves just at the edge of hearing. It was close enough to be human, far enough to be confusing. I waited, holding my breath, until eventually the noises faded. The next morning, I walked down to the front desk while brushing the sleep out of my eyes. The clerk was a middle-aged man with glasses, someone who seemed used to the quiet monotony of a roadside motel. I asked him casually about the room next door, mentioning I had noticed the window open and thought I might have seen someone there. He shook his head, leaned back slightly, and told me no one had been in that room for months. He gestured vaguely to the door, as if to confirm that it was empty, locked, and not rented. I felt a cold prickle at the back of my neck. I returned to my room, the sense of unease lingering. The day was dull, overcast clouds pressing down on the hills, and I spent the hours reading by the window, occasionally looking at the room next door. The curtain still moved as though someone had brushed against it, and I imagined shadows passing behind it, stationary but alive in some way. The thought that someone could be inside without any official record or evidence gnawed at me. I double-checked my door, tested the locks, and even jammed the chain just in case. The motel itself seemed harmless enough, quiet in the daytime except for the occasional guest passing through. Yet something about the way the other room felt alive, while officially empty, kept my attention locked there. That night, I went to bed early, trying to ignore the anxiety building in my chest. I left my jacket folded on the chair in the corner, the small lamp casting soft yellow light against the wall. Around 11, I woke again to noises. This time it was louder, more confident, furniture scraping, a chair being pushed back and forth across the floor, the soft creak of doors opening and closing multiple times. Whispers were closer now, low enough that I could almost sense the words without catching them, a rhythm that suggested someone was moving deliberately, testing the room, moving around. I lay frozen, counting my breath, listening to the familiar clatter, my body tensed in anticipation of what might come next. Eventually, the sound stopped again, this time abruptly, leaving the room in oppressive silence. I lay awake, unable to sleep, listening to the quiet hum of the heating unit and the occasional car on the highway. When dawn came, I walked to the front desk once more, trying to rationalize what I had heard. I asked about the next door room again. Same answer, vacant for months, not rented, officially locked. I even mentioned the whispers and the movement. The clerk raised an eyebrow, nodded, but offered no other explanation. It was clear that he had either heard something like it before or assumed that I had imagined it. Either way, no one was going to validate the experience, and that made it heavier somehow, like carrying a tension that couldn't be shared. I spent the following day on the parkway, walking along the overlooks, trying to let the wind and the forest absorb my attention. I would glance at the motel from the pull-offs, imagining the curtains still moving, wondering about the sounds I had heard. By the third night, I returned, exhausted, but determined to keep track. I sat by the window for hours, watching the empty parking lot, watching the highway lights flicker through the hills. I made sure every lock was engaged, every window latched. Around midnight, the sounds began again, slow, deliberate, furniture scraping, the low thump of footsteps pacing just beyond the walls, doors opening and closing. The whispers were clearer, but still incoherent, testing, calculating, not aggressive but intrusive in a way that put my nerves on edge. I stayed awake until morning, watching every subtle shadow, tracking the curtain next door. Eventually, I resolved not to linger. When I checked out, I noticed that the window in the empty room was wide open, the curtains stirring in the early morning breeze. There was no furniture moved, nothing missing, no signs of forced entry. I felt a lingering impression, the sense that someone or something had been there observing, moving with purpose, but never leaving a trace. I kept driving, the forest falling away behind me, the parkway stretching into pale morning light, the motel fading in the rearview mirror. I never saw another guest occupying that room. The image of the open window and the swaying curtain stayed with me, a quiet, tense reminder that not everything is as it seems, and that some presence can be entirely human, entirely real, and still entirely unexplainable. I had been driving across Nevada all night, the road stretching out straight and empty, the headlights cutting through darkness that seemed to go on forever. My eyes ached from staring at the horizon, and my hands stiffened on the wheel. US 93 had nothing along it for miles, just desert, rocks, and the occasional flicker of a distant sign. My body was screaming for rest, but I kept going, hoping to reach the next town. Then, just past a small rise, I saw the flickering neon of a motel, a single row of rooms against the black of the desert. I swerved onto the gravel lot, the tires crunching over sand and stones. There were no other cars in sight, only the wind carrying the distant sound of rattling signs. The motel itself looked worn down, the paint peeling, the roof warped. The neon sign buzzed unevenly, the letters flickering in and out, casting brief red and blue glows across the cracked asphalt. I parked near the middle of the lot, leaving enough space to see any approaching vehicles. My legs felt stiff as I climbed out of the car. The air was dry, sharp, and cool in a way that made my throat scratch. The desert smelled faintly of sagebrush and dust, a smell that seemed alive in the night. Inside, the receptionist's area was tiny, a wooden desk with peeling varnish and a single dim lamp. The woman behind the desk barely looked up as I entered. She nodded once and handed me a key with no words, just a number scribbled on a piece of paper. Her eyes seemed tired, dull, distant, like she was used to seeing travelers come and go without ever really noticing them. The air conditioning rattled somewhere in the corner, uneven and humming, making the thin walls vibrate slightly. I could hear the faint scraping of the metal chair as I set my bag down. My room smelled of dust and old fabric. The carpet was worn, gray with stains that made it hard to tell their age. The bed was low, the mattress sagging in the middle. The blanket smelled faintly of smoke, the pillow slightly lumpy. The window faced the empty lot, revealing the black desert beyond, punctuated by distant hills that blended into the night. The flickering light from the neon sign outside threw shifting shadows across the walls. I stripped off my driving clothes, feeling my body finally relax as I collapsed onto the bed. The room felt both silent and alive, the air conditioning rattling, the building creaking as it settled. I tried to sleep. My eyelids felt heavy, but the desert heat, or rather the dry chill, kept my skin tight and restless. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it first, a scratching sound outside my door, soft at first, deliberate. It was followed by a low growl, guttural, deep, and resonant, the kind of sound that makes the chest tighten. My heart jumped, and I froze listening. The hallway beyond my door was dark, lit only by the dim glow from a broken bulb overhead. The scratching continued, moving slowly from one side of the corridor to the other. I crept toward the door, careful not to make any noise. I cracked it open just enough to peer into the hall. The floor was carpeted thinly, worn patches exposing the cement beneath. At the far end, I saw a shape crouched low, its eyes faintly red in the dark, reflecting what little light there was. It looked like a large dog, its body lean and muscular, formatted and uneven. It moved with purpose, slow but deliberate, sniffing the carpet, the walls, the corners of the building. Every now and then it emitted a low growl, quiet, but enough to make me draw back. It stopped when it sensed the door opening, freezing, its head tilting slightly. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, it disappeared down the hall, slipping past the other rooms, moving with eerie silence. I stayed pressed against the wall, breathing shallow, waiting. The sound of distant wind carried in from the broken windows and doors, a soft whistle that mingled with the distant hum of the air conditioning. I could hear faint scuffing, like claws on carpet, and then silence. I sat on the bed, staring at the closed door, my muscles tense, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the building, every hum from the air conditioner, every tiny sound outside set my nerves on edge. I checked the locks, bolted the door, and kept the light on, the small lamp throwing weak shadows across the room. Morning came slowly. I didn't sleep. The sky lightened to pale gray, and the sun began to rise over the desert hills, casting long shadows across the motel lot. I went outside, needing air, my heart still racing from the night. The lot was empty, quiet. Nothing moved. The desert stretched endlessly, flat and still, the asphalt and sand baked in the morning light. I walked along the row of rooms, peering into windows. There was no sign of what I had seen, only the faint prints in the dust near the corners of the building. Later, while refueling at a nearby station, I asked a local about the area. The man shrugged, nodding toward the motel in the distance. He told me travelers sometimes reported seeing a large, wild dog around that stretch of desert at night, something that prowled motel lots and parking areas, especially when it was quiet. He called it the desert dog, said it was probably a coyote or a hybrid, something that had learned to hang around people without ever approaching directly. It had been spotted before, he said, mostly at night, eyes glowing red from the lights, a shadow moving silently among the buildings. I left the desert with my heart still racing, but with the knowledge that what I saw wasn't supernatural. It was a wild animal, cunning and adapted to the dark, waiting for quiet places to roam. Driving away, I kept my eyes on the edges of the road, scanning the shadows where the desert met the asphalt. The sun rose higher, burning away the chill and the fear, and I felt a strange relief mixed with lingering unease. The motel faded behind me, a lone row of rooms against the endless desert, a place where the night held a predator that moved like a shadow, silent and deliberate, testing boundaries without ever fully revealing itself. I didn't stop again on that stretch of highway. Every mile I put behind me felt lighter, but the memory stayed. The rattling air conditioner, the flickering lights, the red glow of those eyes. Every detail remained vivid. The motel was a marker, a reminder that even in the emptiest, most desolate places, the desert has its own life, and sometimes, travelers become part of it without ever intending to. I reached the next town and finally pulled over at a busy hotel with thick walls, proper locks, and other guests wandering the halls. It felt normal, safe. The desert dog was gone from my mind then, but I knew it would always exist somewhere back along that road, waiting for the next traveler to slow down. The night had been long, silent, and real. By dawn, I was moving again, but the image of those glowing eyes never fully left me. I was driving through Oklahoma in February 2020, making the long haul from Dallas to Tulsa. It was late, past 1 in the morning, and I had been behind the wheel for hours. My body was screaming for sleep, and the only thing keeping me moving was the thought of a bed and a hot cup of coffee. I knew I wouldn't make it to Tulsa without a break. The nearest exit promised a truck stop with a small motel attached. I didn't have expectations, just somewhere cheap, clean enough, and quiet enough to rest for a few hours. The motel was the kind of place you could drive past a dozen times and never notice during the day. A strip of faded brick with a neon sign that flickered more than it glowed. I pulled into the lot, and immediately smelled a mix of cigarette smoke and chemical cleaner. The scent hit my nose even before I got out of the car. It was sharp, acrid, a combination that made my stomach knot slightly. I was too tired to care much. I went inside, the fluorescent light in the lobby buzzing overhead, and the air conditioning weakly circulating the stale warmth of the building. A tired janitor with a blank face handed me a key. The only other sound was the distant rumble of a semi on the highway and the muffled hum of a vending machine. I took the stairs slowly, carrying my bag, and found the room. It smelled the same as the lobby, smoke and cleaner, but in a more concentrated, overwhelming form. The carpet was rough and cheap, the beige color dulled from years of wear. The fluorescent light in the ceiling flickered intermittently, casting the room in uneven patches of brightness and shadow. The bedspread was thin synthetic, with a faint musty smell that suggested it had been washed, but not recently. The bathroom door was a cheap hollow wood, and the lock didn't work at all. I tried it once, gave up, and left it. I undressed just enough to settle onto the bed, leaving my clothes on the floor nearby, and tried to fall asleep. My body wanted it more than my mind. I could feel the tension from hours of driving in my shoulders, the dull ache in my lower back, the tight knot in my neck. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the highway and the occasional hiss of the radiator. I closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come immediately. I kept thinking about the drive, about making it to Tulsa, about the coffee that awaited me in the morning. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted. Hours passed, or maybe only minutes. I woke suddenly, the need to use the restroom forcing me upright. My body was heavy, uncoordinated, but I managed to swing my legs over the edge of the bed. The fluorescent light flickered again, stuttering in the darkness. The carpet felt rough under my bare feet. I walked to the bathroom, reaching for the door, and froze. The lock, the cheap hollow lock I had already known didn't work, had been tampered with. There were scratch marks around it, small but deep, as if someone had tried to force it open. My stomach twisted. My mind scrambled. I checked the room quickly. Nothing moved. The janitor had told me no one else was in there, and I wanted to believe it. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it was old damage. Maybe some previous guest had broken the lock, and it had never been repaired. But the scratches were fresh, sharp in the light. I ran my fingers over them, confirming they hadn't been there before I went to bed. My chest tightened. I was alone, or at least I had been, and the thought that someone could have been in this room while I slept made the air feel thick, heavy. I stepped into the bathroom, careful not to touch anything unnecessary, and checked the space. Nothing seemed out of place, except for the lock. I turned the faucet on and off, made sure the toilet was functioning, forced myself to breathe slowly. I needed to get back to the bed, to regain some sense of safety. I slept fully clothed that night, keeping one eye open, lying on my side closest to the wall, farthest from the bathroom. Every creak of the building made my muscles tense. Every faint sound from the highway or the air conditioner had me alert. Sleep was fitful, fragmented, shadows stretching across the room in the flickering fluorescent light. I kept imagining someone standing in the bathroom doorway, someone waiting for me to lower my guard. Morning came slowly. The light from outside was pale and weak, filtering through the blinds and casting lines across the floor. I forced myself to get out of bed, walking carefully toward the bathroom. My foot hit something solid, and I froze. There was a shoe print on the tile, dark against the pale ceramic. It was too large to be mine, the sole patterned differently than the ones I had worn. My hands shook slightly as I crouched to inspect it. The print was clear, detailed, a heavy presence left behind without explanation. I felt the motel room close in around me, the walls pressing against my chest. I dressed quickly, my hands fumbling with buttons, zippers, the straps of my bag. I grabbed the key and left the room without turning back. The hallway smelled the same, smoke and cleaner lingering in the corners. The janitor was at the bottom of the stairs, sweeping lazily. He didn't look up when I went past. I didn't wait for an explanation, didn't ask questions. I shoved the key across the counter when I reached the lobby and left, the cold air outside hitting my face like a slap, clearing my head slightly but leaving the unease in my chest. The parking lot was empty except for a couple of semis. I got into the car and started the engine, the vibration under my hands a comfort compared to the tension in the motel room. I glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something behind me, but the lot was empty. I pulled onto the highway, letting the tires roll over the asphalt, the hum of the car, and the occasional rumble from other vehicles grounding me in the physical world. I replayed the night in my mind repeatedly as I drove. The broken lock, the scratch marks, the shoe print, they didn't make sense, but they were real. The janitor had insisted no one else had been in my room, but that fact alone didn't change what I had found. I forced myself to analyze the possibilities rationally. Maybe a guest had broken the lock and left the print hours before. Maybe it had been a maintenance error. Maybe something had been overlooked. None of it removed the sense of violation, the feeling that my privacy had been penetrated, that I had been watched while I slept. Coffee was waiting in Tulsa, but I didn't think about it. I thought about the drive, about staying alert, about the awareness I would carry with me now. I learned suddenly and deeply that exhaustion made you vulnerable, that even the most ordinary places could contain threats invisible in the daytime, imperceptible in a hurried glance. I kept one hand on the wheel, one eye on the road, every shadow in my periphery a potential hazard, every movement in my mirrors a possible intrusion. By the time I reached Tulsa, the feeling of being watched had eased, though it never fully disappeared. I parked at the hotel I had booked, more expensive and sterile than the truck stop motel, and I stayed in that room until the next morning, showering, sleeping fully clothed out of habit, leaving the key on the counter when I left. The motel off I-40 stayed in my mind for weeks. I replayed the details repeatedly, the smell, the flickering light, the scratches, the shoe print, and I realized the story would never be simple or clean. It wasn't about ghosts or strangers lurking in shadows. It was about the quiet, unnoticed breaches of normalcy, about the way a cheap room in the middle of a long drive could become a place of fear without warning. The sensation lingered in my muscles, in the tightness behind my eyes when I closed them, in the cautious way I approached any hotel or motel afterward. I never went back. I never even passed that exit again intentionally. The experience taught me something about vigilance, about exhaustion, about the small, physical realities that could unsettle you far more than any imagined threat. It was a lesson paid for with unease, and I carried it quietly, a reminder that sometimes the simplest trips, the most ordinary rooms, could hold something dangerous. Not supernatural, not monstrous, but real, physical, and utterly violating. Even now, years later, I can picture the room clearly. The flickering fluorescent light, the carpet with its thin, coarse fibers, the bathroom door with the jagged scratches around the lock. I can picture the shoe print, dark against the tile, a mark of another presence, a proof that someone had been there when I wasn't looking, when I was at my most vulnerable. The memory is as sharp as it was the morning I left. I carry it with me on any long drive, a quiet, unshakable awareness that ordinary places can conceal extraordinary threats, and that vigilance is not just a habit, but a necessity. I told myself I would forget it, that the highway, the motel, the sleep-deprived paranoia were just one incident, an anomaly. But the image of that shoe print, so clearly defined, too large to be mine, remains. It reminds me that some nights are real nightmares, grounded not in imagination, but in the fragile truths of isolation, exhaustion, and vulnerability. Every cheap motel on a long drive now carries that shadow in my mind, and I check every lock, every latch, every corner, knowing how thin the boundary can be between safety and the awareness that you were never truly alone. That night, that motel, that room, it was the kind of fear that lingers, not in sudden shocks or loud screams, but in the quiet, in the slow accumulation of small details that tell you your world is not as controlled as you thought. It was an ordinary night, turned extraordinary by the simple, undeniable fact that someone had been there when they shouldn't have been, and I had no way of knowing when or why. The lesson was absolute. Vigilance is earned, and sometimes the only warning comes after the fact, in the scratch marks on a lock and the imprint of a shoe you will never forget. I never returned to that motel, never retraced the route, and never allowed myself to become so exhausted again without planning for safety. It was a brutal, grounding experience, and it left a mark as enduring as the shoe print itself. The memory is detailed, precise, and utterly real. A night I survived but will always remember, a place I left with my life intact, but my certainty shattered. I was driving west on I-70 late at night, somewhere in rural Kansas, trying to make it to St. Louis before morning. It was the kind of drive that leaves your vision blurry around the edges, the highway lit only by your headlights and the occasional reflective sign. The flat fields stretched out on either side of the road, dark except for the faint glimmer of distant farm lights. I had left Denver hours earlier, the the road already a long ribbon behind me, and I was fighting a creeping sleepiness that came from a combination of early mornings, long hours on the interstate, and the sameness of the scenery. My plan had been to push through, to arrive before sunrise, but the more I drove, the heavier my eyelids became. At some point, I realized I needed to stop. My body was tense, my jaw aching from holding it shut for hours, my hands stiff on the wheel. I scanned the roadside for any sign of a motel or truck stop, and the first lit sign I saw said Silver Pines Motel, a small, boxy building with faded paint and neon letters flickering weakly in the darkness. I exited the highway, my tires crunching over gravel, and pulled into a nearly empty lot. There was only one other vehicle, a large white semi parked near the far end of the building, and a lone trucker leaning against it with his arms crossed. The air was cold, damp with the faint scent of the fields, and a hint of diesel from the parked truck. I felt the relief of stopping, of not having to keep my eyes on the road, and even the thought of sleeping in an unfamiliar place felt better than pushing onward. The lobby was small and dimly lit, the carpeting worn and fraying along the edges. The receptionist's area was clean, though sparse, and the smell of coffee lingered faintly in the air, though no coffee had been made recently. I signed in quickly, took my key, and drove around to the side of the building where my room was located. It was the kind of motel room you see off the highway, practical but unremarkable. A queen bed, a small desk, a television that hadn't been upgraded in a long time, and a window that faced the parking lot. I unloaded my bag, set the key on the nightstand, and immediately felt the tension of the drive begin to ease. The hum of the refrigerator and the faint buzz from the overhead fluorescent light were oddly comforting after hours of silence on the highway. I showered quickly, letting the warm water wash off the road, the fatigue pressing against me like a physical weight. Afterward, I lay down on the bed, my eyes closed, thinking I would sleep immediately. The room was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of the building settling, and the muffled rumble of the highway in the distance. I drifted in and out of sleep, aware of my body's exhaustion, but not fully letting go. Somewhere around 2:20 in the morning, I was fully awake, though I didn't know why. At first, it was subtle, a faint tapping against the floor from the opposite end of the hall. I ignored it at first, thinking maybe it was the trucker moving around outside, or the building settling, the old boards stretching and contracting in the cold night air. But the tapping became clearer, deliberate, and it was not random. Slow, rhythmic, consistent. Footsteps. Someone was walking up and down the hall, pacing, heavy enough to make me tense, deliberate enough to feel almost like they were thinking about each step. I froze, listening, straining to hear over the low buzz of the refrigerator and my own breathing. The footsteps stopped, then began again, slow and methodical, echoing against the thin walls. I waited, trying to convince myself it was nothing, just the trucker outside or the building shifting. I checked the window, pulling the curtain aside. The parking lot was empty except for the trucker and his rig. No one was visible, no lighted car doors, no shadows. I even stepped outside onto the balcony that ran along the front of the rooms. The air was still cool, the darkness pressing against the edges of the motel lot. I walked the length of the balcony, peering into the darkness of the parking lot and the field beyond, but there was no one. The footsteps continued inside, though circling, moving from end to end, slow and controlled, impossible to ignore. I locked the door again and flicked on every light I could find. Desk lamp, nightstand lamp, bathroom light, even the ceiling light, hoping that visibility would somehow discourage whatever was making the noise. Nothing changed. The steps kept moving along the hall, slow, almost casual, yet purposeful, carrying a weight that suggested presence. I imagined the sound bouncing off the doors and walls, a single person walking slowly in their socks, perhaps, or with boots that thudded against the linoleum. The motel was small, rooms on a single floor, no hidden corners, but the sound made the space feel larger, more complex than it actually was. I tried counting steps, but it didn't help. The pacing seemed to circle, returning to the same point over and over, never rushing, never pausing for more than a moment. I didn't sleep again that night. Every time I closed my eyes, the sound returned, closer or farther, but always deliberate. I tried imagining explanations, a maintenance worker, another guest, the trucker outside moving around, but nothing fit perfectly. I considered checking the hallway myself, opening my door and stepping into the dim corridor, but the thought of doing so froze me. The idea of walking out into the hall and discovering someone there, for no reason, in the middle of the night, was worse than the sound itself. I felt trapped in my room, the walls a fragile barrier between me and whoever was walking outside, or whatever it was that made the steps. Hours passed. The hall remained empty as far as I could see, yet the footsteps circled with a slow inevitability. The clock ticked toward dawn, each minute longer than the last. My body ached from lying in one position for so long, my throat dry from nervous tension. I sat on the bed, hands pressed against my knees, staring at the far wall, waiting for daylight like a lifeline. Occasionally, I heard the soft scrape of the trucker moving in the parking lot, the rumble of the highway beyond the motel, and then silence again. But the hall was alive with pacing, a measured, quiet, relentless sound that refused to stop. I tried to rationalize it, thinking maybe the building's structure exaggerated small noises. Maybe someone had been up late checking locks, cleaning, or fumbling in a distant room. Every logical explanation fell short. The sound was too intentional, too rhythmic, too constant. It made me aware of the stillness of the rest of the world, the emptiness of the motel lot, the weight of the night pressing against the building's thin walls. Finally, the first light of morning seeped through the window. Pale, cold, almost gray sunlight stretching over the empty parking lot. With it came a subtle shift. The footsteps faded, slowly, gradually, until they disappeared entirely. The relief was immediate, like the tension in my muscles released all at once. I walked to the door, checked the hall, every room I could see, every corner. Empty. No maintenance carts, no cleaning staff, no shadows slipping out of sight. The hall was empty, silent, ordinary. I went outside, feeling the cold air on my face, my stomach tightening from the night's tension. The trucker had moved on, leaving only the tracks of his semi behind. I walked around the building, inspected doors and windows. Everything was locked, undisturbed. I even knocked on doors, tested locks, looked for any sign of another guest or a worker. There was nothing. No one had been there. I packed my bag, feeling exhausted, worn from the vigilance that sleep could not provide. The motel was ordinary in the daylight, nothing strange about it, and yet I felt the shadow of the night pressing against memory. I checked out quickly, handed the key to the receptionist, who was awake now and greeted me with a polite nod, and returned to the highway. My car started without hesitation, the engine familiar and grounding. As I drove, I replayed the night in my head, every step, every echo, every moment of that slow, circling sound. I could not find an explanation that fit, yet I knew it was not supernatural, not imagined entirely, not a dream. It had a physical presence, a weight that left me tense for the rest of the drive. By mid-morning, the memory had faded slightly, replaced by the movement of traffic, the scenery of rolling plains, the rhythm of the highway beneath my tires. I reached St. Louis later than planned, checked into a proper hotel, and tried to shake the lingering unease. I told myself it was an empty hall, a trucker moving in the night, a building settling, the echoes of an isolated place in the middle of Kansas. Every explanation made sense in fragments, but none satisfied completely. I never saw the source, never found a shadow, never caught a figure. The steps had stopped with daylight, and that was enough. I never returned to that motel. Weeks later, I looked up reviews online, searching for any mention of strange sounds, pacing, or late-night disturbances. There were none. No complaints, no stories, just ordinary ratings about clean rooms and friendly staff. It was, I concluded, simply a night out of place, a building alive in ways that made the quiet unbearable, a solo traveler in the middle of a rural highway encountering something ordinary, yet inexplicably unnerving. I have driven past that exit since, sometimes late at night, sometimes during the day. The motel is still there, quiet, blinking neon against the flat fields. I never stop, never pause, and I never stay. The memory of those footsteps, slow, deliberate, unclaimed, stays with me, a reminder that emptiness can carry its own weight, and that in the middle of the night, silence is never truly silent. Even now, when I drive long distances alone, I find myself listening to the subtle sounds of my car, the road, the wind outside. I check the empty parking lots, the hallways of motels, the quiet spaces, aware that sound can carry in ways you do not expect, that the ordinary can feel deliberate, that a solitary presence can leave traces long after it is gone. The Silver Pines Motel remains in my memory, a place of restless hallways, measured footsteps, and a night that lasted longer than any stretch of highway. It is not haunted, not in the way stories tell, but it is marked by the weight of a presence I never identified, a reminder of how the ordinary can feel like a quiet threat when the night is deep, the lot is empty, and the road is endless. I have never forgotten that night, the long minutes of pacing echoing through the hall, the helplessness of being confined behind a locked door, the relief of daylight that revealed nothing, the ordinary building made strange by absence. It is the kind of memory that lingers without explanation, that shapes how I travel, how I approach solitude, how I measure silence. I-70 stretches on, miles and hours of road ahead, but I know now that the quiet spaces are never empty, that the night holds a weight of its own, and that even in the absence of people, the sound of footsteps can be the only proof of life in a place where life seems gone. The Silver Pines Motel remains a ghost in memory only. I will never stay there again, and I drive past it quickly now, leaving it to its empty hallways and the lingering echo of deliberate steps, a night fully lived and fully explained, if not fully understood.